Why is there a bundle of yellowed letters hidden beneath the warped floorboards? The farmhouse had been silent for decades, its white paint flaking in long, jagged strips, the porch sagging like it had given up under the weight of time. She knelt on the threshold, a single cardboard box at her feet containing her father's old deeds and tax records, her hands trembling as she touched the wrought iron doorknob, cold and pitted with rust. Everyone in town had laughed when she insisted on keeping this abandoned pile of wood and plaster at the edge of a forgotten field, insisting it was worthless, a final burden she could neither sell nor ignore. The air smelled of damp pine and decay, and in the faint light of a gray morning, the floor beneath her creaked with each careful step, hinting at hollow spaces, secrets waiting for a hand brave enough to lift them. She pressed a fingertip against one loosened board, feeling the slight give, the hollow echo beneath it, and wondered what had been hidden there for so long. 3 days earlier, she had driven down the winding county road in her old Honda Civic, a pile of letters tucked into the passenger seat beside a worn leather tote with only $237 left from her father's savings. A few overdue bills stacked neatly in the glove compartment, and her grandmother's brass key swinging from a chain around her neck. The engine rattled over the cracked asphalt as she passed abandoned barns and overgrown fields, every mile reminding her that she had no other claim, no other roof over her head beyond this dilapidated farmhouse. The morning air carried the scent of wet soil and rotting leaves, and the tiny porch light flickered above her head as she fumbled with the rusted mailbox, extracting a crumpled deed that her father had left in a manila envelope, edges frayed and ink faded from years of neglect. She slid the deed into her coat pocket and glanced down at the box, noting a bent coffee mug and a photo album of her childhood, the corners curling and water-stained, remnants of the life she had almost lost. She tested the door again. It groaned as the latch resisted, and as she pushed inside, the floors sighed under her weight, each plank a reminder of the house's neglect and the work it would take to reclaim it. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light piercing broken windows, and the faint scratch of a ledger peeking from beneath a floorboard caught her eye, a subtle glint of brass binding just visible through the crack. Her hand hovered over it, her pulse quickening, sensing that this forgotten object was more than it appeared, though she could not yet know the lives it recorded, the debts quietly paid, the gratitude silently earned. For a moment, she froze, listening to the distant rumble of traffic and the wind whistling through a broken shutter, feeling the farmhouse breathe around her, as if aware that she had arrived. Then, gently, almost reverently, she eased the board further and glimpsed the first corner of a journal. The leather cover cracked, edges curled, and in that instant, a shiver ran down her spine. This was not just old wood and paper. It was a record of someone's hidden generosity, a secret buried beneath the floor that demanded to be uncovered. Her fingers were still pressed against the edge of the loose floorboard when the silence behind her shifted, not into sound, but into memory, the kind that presses heavier than noise. The journal's corner vanished back into shadow beneath the wood as if the house itself had flinched. Outside, a truck passed slowly on the gravel road, tires crunching like distant judgment, and she instinctively pulled her hand away, hiding the gap with a careful press of the plank. 3 days earlier, that same instinct had kept her from breaking completely when the eviction notice was taped to her apartment door in town, its red ink already fading in the morning rain. She had stood there for a full minute, keys still in her hand, staring at the words "notice to vacate" as if repetition might change them. Inside, her landlord had already changed the locks on the storage shed without warning, her last 2 boxes of belongings shoved onto the porch like unwanted inventory. Kitchenware, winter coats, and a cracked photo frame of her father in front of this very farmhouse years ago. Her bank account had $211.47 left, a number so precise it felt like an insult, and the hospital bill reminder on her phone kept lighting up every 4 hours, vibrating against her thigh like something trying to remind her she was already running out of time. She had worked nights at a small clinic until the layoffs came without warning, a stack of printed notices handed out like receipts for a life being discontinued, and her severance had barely covered 2 weeks of gas and groceries. Her relatives had offered nothing but advice over short phone calls. Sell the land, stop clinging, let it go like everyone else did. Even the lawyer had said it gently, sliding the appraisal across the table as if pushing away something dirty. It's just a structure, not an asset. But when she stood at the farmhouse door, she hadn't signed anything. Instead, she had taken the brass key from her pocket, the only thing her father had left that still carried weight, and turned it in the lock that no one else wanted to touch. Now, inside the house, she moved carefully through the living room where dust clung to her coat like ash, her boots leaving soft prints across warped wood. Every step reminded her there was no backup plan waiting in town, no apartment to return to, no family offering shelter, only this collapsing structure and whatever truth it might still be holding. The cardboard box she carried was set down on a broken table leg, its contents shifting slightly. Deed papers, a faded insurance policy, and a handwritten note from her father with ink smudged by time. She unfolded it again, even though she already knew the words, as if repetition might reveal something hidden between the lines. Outside, headlights briefly washed across the window, and she froze, listening for footsteps, but only silence returned. Somewhere in the house wood groaned again, deeper this time, as if responding to weight shifting beneath it, and when she looked back toward the loosened board she had uncovered moments earlier, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A faint smear of fresh dust disturbed along its edge, as if someone or something had been there recently. The faint smear of disturbed dust along the loose floorboard lingered in her mind as she slowly stepped back, as if the house had just exhaled something it had been holding for years. The journal remained hidden beneath the wood, but its presence now felt heavier than the silence around it, like a pulse she couldn't yet name. She lowered herself onto a broken chair in the corner of the living room, its fabric damp with years of humidity, and for the first time since arriving, she let the full weight of what she had inherited settle on her shoulders. There was no heating, no running water, and the electricity meter outside the farmhouse had been sealed with a county lock tag marked final notice, meaning even light would be temporary at best. Her phone screen lit up briefly, $211.47 in her account, unchanged, unmoving, as if time itself had stopped offering her anything more. 3 days earlier, she had stood in a county courthouse surrounded by people in pressed coats and clean shoes, listening as the clerk read aloud the list of properties no one else wanted. Parcel 14 had been last on the sheet. Abandoned farmhouse, structural damage, no utilities, no value estimated. The auctioneer had barely looked at it when he announced the starting bid, $750, or maybe it had been $500. Either way, no one in the room had raised a hand except her. She had hesitated only a second, feeling every eye shift toward her as if she had just volunteered for a mistake. Sold as is, the auctioneer had said flatly, already bored, and when her hand went up again to confirm, someone behind her had let out a quiet laugh, the kind that doesn't need words. A developer in the front row had leaned back and whispered, "Let it rot," loud enough for her to hear. Even the clerk had paused when she signed the deed, her eyes flicking to the parcel number twice, as if verifying she hadn't misread it. "You sure you want this one?" she had asked without judgment, but with something close to disbelief. Now, back inside the farmhouse, she could still feel that moment in her fingers as she unfolded the deed again. The paper thin, edges softened by years of storage in some forgotten county file cabinet. A faint stamp near the top caught her attention. Parcel 14B, handwritten over an older number that had been crossed out, suggesting the land had once been part of something larger, something divided. Outside, wind pressed against the broken siding, making the house creak as if it was shifting its weight to listen. She reached for the brass key on her chain, the one her father had left her, and tried it against the front door lock out of instinct more than hope. It didn't fit cleanly, it stuck halfway, refusing to turn fully, as if the mechanism itself didn't recognize what she had been given. And as she pulled it back, noticing a faint residue of oil along its teeth, she realized something small but unsettling. Someone had used this key recently enough that it still wasn't fully dry. She pushed the front door with a soft shove, and it groaned as the warped wood protested, the old brass knob rattling in its corroded mount. Dust motes hung in the shafts of morning light piercing through the cracked window panes, catching on spiderwebs and the edges of a faded open sign leaning against the counter. She stepped inside, the floorboard beneath her heel creaking in a hollow echo that reminded her of every empty apartment she had once tried to call home. The air smelled of damp pine and old oil, faint traces of her father's last attempts at repairs lingering in the corners, mixed with the acrid tang of rotting plaster. She set her cardboard box down on the center of the main room, the thud muted by a threadbare rug that smelled faintly of must and years of neglect, and began to pull a thin blanket from the tote, draping it across a corner where sunlight fell weakly through the broken glass. Her hand lingered on a cracked countertop, paint flaking beneath her fingertips, revealing layers of faded reds and blues, and she noticed a coffee mug tipped on its side with dried rings of black liquid inside. A calendar on the wall was stopped at October 1978, its pages curling and yellowed, and a family photo had fallen face down to the floor, one corner bent, the subjects unrecognizable under layers of dust. She shuffled over to a window and tested the single outlet with her phone charger. Sparks hissed faintly, and the cable trembled, leaving her to count the last 5 cans of soup she had left for the week. Pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders, she dialed a familiar number, hearing only the click of a voicemail greeting and the echo of silence. As she moved cautiously across the room, her eyes caught a subtle shift. One wall panel near the corner was newer than the surrounding wood, the paint slightly brighter, almost out of place, with a tiny gap along its edge that suggested it could be pried open. Her hand hovered over the gap, fingers brushing the cool, uneven surface, feeling the faint vibrations of something hollow behind it. Somewhere above, the roof groaned where a missing shingle let the wind whistle inside, and from beneath her foot, a soft rattle came from under a floorboard she hadn't yet dared to lift. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving her heart thudding, realizing that, despite the decay, she was not entirely alone in the house. The wall panel remained slightly misaligned as she stood there, her fingers still hovering in the air as if the house might react if she touched it too hard. The faint draft slipping through the gap carried a colder air than the rest of the room, and she made a quiet mental note of it before forcing herself to turn away. Survival came first. Questions came later. She pulled on her jacket tighter and began clearing the living room, dragging broken pieces of wood into a single corner where she could later decide what to burn, what to keep, and what to fear. Outside, rain started tapping softly against the roof, filling the silence with a steady metallic rhythm that echoed through the hollow structure like a slow heartbeat. Her hands, already rough from years of hospital work and cheap cleaning jobs, tightened around a broom she had found leaning behind the counter, and she began sweeping shards of glass from the floor where the window had long ago surrendered to weather. Each stroke sent dust into the air, and she coughed once, steadying herself as she remembered how many nights she had cleaned patient rooms after emergencies, long after everyone else had gone home. That kind of work didn't scare her. What scared her was stopping. She moved to the counter, wiping layers of grime with a damp cloth, revealing faint stains in the wood grain that looked almost like old burn marks. A tipped-over receipt printer sat half dead beside a rusted cash register, its drawer slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry decades ago. She tugged it gently, and it resisted before giving way with a dry metallic snap, revealing nothing but dust and a few crumpled receipts. One of them had a name printed in faded ink, someone she didn't recognize, and a date that didn't match any of the documents her father had left behind. She folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket without understanding why. By midday, she had patched a broken window with a plastic sheet and duct tape, the wind pressing against it so hard it bowed inward like breathing. Her phone, now at 3%, lay on the counter beside a small pile of unopened mail she had collected from the porch earlier, most of it addressed to people who no longer lived anywhere near this town. She ate half a can of cold soup straight from the tin, sitting on an overturned crate, listening to the refrigerator hum faintly even though it was unplugged, a ghost vibration she couldn't explain. When she stood again, her knees ached sharply, and she braced herself against the counter, noticing that one of the lower drawers had been nailed shut from the inside. Not locked, nailed. 3 rough nails driven through the wood, not aligned like a repair, but like a deliberate attempt to seal something away. She pressed her fingers along the edges, testing it, and the wood gave a faint hollow reply from within, as if something had shifted recently behind it. She told herself it was just old storage, just another broken part of a forgotten building trying to hold itself together. But as she stepped back, wiping dust from her hands, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A thin line of fresh sawdust trailing from beneath the nailed drawer, still pale against the darker floorboards, as if something hidden behind it had been disturbed only moments ago. The thin line of fresh sawdust beneath the nailed drawer was still there when she noticed the knock on the front door. Soft, deliberate, not the wind. This time, she froze with her hand still resting on the counter, listening. Another knock followed, slower, heavier, like someone who already knew the house would answer eventually. When she opened the door, the rain had eased into a mist, and a man in his late 60s stood on the porch holding a faded toolbox in one hand and a brown paper grocery bag in the other. His jacket smelled faintly of motor oil and cedar smoke, and his boots left dark prints on the warped wood as he stepped inside without waiting for invitation. "Didn't think anyone had moved back in here," he said, looking around slowly, his eyes catching on the plastic-covered window and the duct-taped frame like he was reading a familiar story written in new damage. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him the way she had learned to study patience years ago. Posture, breath, hesitation. "I'm not breaking anything," he added quietly, lifting the toolbox slightly. "Just heard the place had light again." The way he said light carried a weight she didn't understand yet. She asked his name, and he paused just long enough for it to feel intentional. "Harold," he said finally. "Used to run the hardware store 2 blocks down before it closed." He set the grocery bag on the counter, sliding it toward her without ceremony. Canned soup, bread, a small carton of eggs, the kind of practical kindness that didn't ask permission. "You'll need more than duct tape if you're staying here through winter," he added, nodding toward the window she had patched earlier. She noticed his eyes drifted briefly toward the nailed drawer in the corner, and for the first time since she arrived, someone reacted to it without confusion, only recognition, quickly buried. She stepped closer, her voice lower now. "You know this house?" The question made him exhale through his nose, almost like a laugh that didn't fully form. "Everybody around here knew it," he said. "Your father made sure of that." At the mention of her father, something in his expression tightened. Not sadness exactly, but caution, like stepping around a memory with broken glass in it. She moved toward the counter, pulling out the folded receipt she had found earlier. "I found this in the register," she said, placing it down between them. His eyes landed on it immediately. The color drained slightly from his face before he masked it with a slow nod. "Yeah," he said, almost to himself. "That's from before they tried to erase everything." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't let him escape it. "Erase what?" she asked. He looked toward the nailed drawer again, then back at her, and for a moment the house felt smaller, like it was listening. "Your father helped people here," he said carefully. "More than people remember, or want to remember." He reached into his pocket and placed a small metal key on the counter beside the receipt. It was old, scratched, the edges worn smooth, and when she looked at it closely, her breath caught. It matched the brass key on her chain in shape, but not in cut, like a missing piece from the same lock. "I was supposed to give that back to him," Harold added quietly. "But the night everything changed, I never got the chance." The words hung there unfinished, refusing to become explanation. Outside, the mist pressed against the broken window, and for the first time, she noticed something carved faintly into the underside of the counter where his hand had rested. A name she had already seen once before, in ink on a ledger page she had not yet fully understood. And as she looked up at Harold, she caught him watching her not like a stranger, but like someone finally standing in the right place after being gone too long. The house settled around her like it had been waiting for her to notice something for decades. Rain tapped against the corrugated metal roof in a rhythmic patter, mixing with the faint groan of floorboards under her weight. She moved slowly through the kitchen, flashlight in hand, scanning the walls and counters as if every shadow might betray a secret. The panel near the corner, which had seemed uniform before, now stood out, the paint slightly newer, streaked differently than the surrounding wall, as if someone had patched over it without finishing the job properly. She tapped it with her knuckles, listening to a hollow reply that resonated unlike the solid plaster elsewhere. Moving toward the freezer, she crouched and pressed her ear to the metal side, hearing the faintest rattle of empty space behind it, almost like it had a cavity waiting to be discovered. A locker tucked against the far wall tilted slightly, the screws holding it in place driven at odd angles, not matching the original installation. She knelt to inspect the floor, noticing that one of the floorboards near the fireplace was newer, a slightly lighter oak, worn only at the edges, its surface too smooth compared to the surrounding planks. Her hand brushed along it, following a faint scratch that ran diagonally, disappearing into the corner where the wall met the floor, leading her gaze upward toward the mismatched panel. The radio in the corner hissed static intermittently, as if punctuating her observations, and the smell of damp would mixed with the faint tang of old oil. She stepped back, shone her flashlight down the diagonal scratch, and noticed the floorboard edge lifted slightly, creating a thin gap that hadn't been there before. Outside, a dark sedan rolled slowly past the farmhouse, headlights dim, disappearing into the mist, leaving her unsettled. She crouched, comparing the scratch to the pattern of nails on the locker and the patch on the wall, realizing that these anomalies were not random. Her hand hovered over the floorboard, pressing gently. It shifted under her fingers just enough to confirm a deliberate hollow space beneath. The hollow thrum of the board seemed to answer, and she understood that something, long hidden, carefully concealed, was waiting just below, purposefully veiled from anyone who hadn't been patient enough to notice. The floorboard gave a soft, reluctant shift under her hand, like something beneath it had been holding its breath for far too long. She knelt fully now, rain still ticking against the roof above, her flashlight angled low as she traced the exact seam where the newer plank met the older wood. The gap was thin, no more than 1/4 of an inch, but it was intentional, clean in a way that didn't belong in a house this broken. She pressed her fingertips into it, then reached for the small screwdriver she had left on the counter earlier, the same one Harold had brought without asking questions. The screw came loose with a dry, tired squeak, and for a moment the only sound was the wind slipping under the door. When the plank finally lifted, it didn't resist, it released. Beneath it was a shallow cavity lined with aged cloth, gray with dust, carefully wrapped around something rectangular and rigid. Her breath caught before she even touched it. She eased the bundle out slowly, as if the house might protest, and placed it on the floorboards in front of her. The fabric fell away in brittle folds, revealing a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked at the spine, the surface stained with faint rings of what looked like old coffee and oil. A thin brass clasp held it shut, tarnished but still intact, engraved with initials so worn they were almost invisible. She hesitated before opening it, then unlatched the clasp with her thumb. The sound it made was small, but in the silence of the farmhouse it felt final. Inside, the pages were dense with handwriting, names, dates, dollar amounts, and brief notes written in different inks over different years. Her flashlight swept across the first page, and her eyes stopped on a single entry near the top. A name she recognized but could not place immediately. Below it, a date, April 17, 1986, and beside it, a notation that made her stomach tighten. Route 11 Property Assistance finalized. Her fingers instinctively turned the page, slower now, as if afraid of what might come next. Another entry, the same handwriting but years earlier. A small sum listed, a second name she had heard only once before, mentioned in passing by Harold, cut off too quickly to notice at the time. She sat back onto the cold floorboards, the ledger resting open on her knees, and for a moment she simply stared at the ink, trying to force it into something ordinary. Donations, bookkeeping, old farm records, but none of it aligned with how carefully it had been hidden. Her hands began to shake slightly, so she closed the ledger, pressed it flat against her chest, then opened it again as if confirming it hadn't changed. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the gravel road, distant but distinct enough to make her freeze. She slid the ledger quickly into the cardboard box beside her father's papers, tucking it beneath a folded blanket just as headlights briefly washed across the living room window. She didn't move until the light passed. When it did, she pulled the ledger back out, just enough to recheck the first page, and that's when she saw it again. Written in darker ink at the bottom corner, a signature she had seen before, once, years ago, on a document she had never fully understood. M. Cole, Route 11 Farmhouse Trust Authorization. She ran her fingers over the yellowed page of the ledger again, feeling the indentations of a pen that had pressed firmly decades ago, and a faint scent of tobacco and old cedar drifted up from the spine, as though her father had been there yesterday. She compared the names with the small receipts she had tucked aside, the ones from local stores she barely remembered, and realized that each dollar, each note, each scribbled some matched people she had seen struggle in town. Families living paycheck to paycheck, widows trying to keep their homes, children walking home through rain-soaked streets. Harold's voice echoed softly from the corner where he had leaned against the counter earlier. He did what he could, he said, eyes distant. But some things had to stay hidden. Some names, some debts, some nights. She traced the ink across the ledger page where her father had written her name, her pulse quickening at the realization she had been protected from afar all these years. The photo tucked behind the ledger fell slightly, showing a younger version of her father in front of the farmhouse. A child on his knee she had never known existed, the edges curling from damp. She picked it up and inhaled, catching the faint scent of soap and wood smoke, the same she remembered on Sunday mornings when he would leave the house early. In the envelope beneath the ledger, she found hospital bills stamped paid. A series of them for families she recognized only by first name and last initial, paid quietly, without recognition, often long after she had left town for college or work. Each page she turned revealed subtle layers. Notes about a mortgage covered, letters folded but never mailed, a church record of a family rescued from eviction, all detailed with dates that didn't match the public record, signatures overwritten in places, almost like someone had rewritten history by hand. Harold shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the corner where the nailed drawer still waited, and she noticed a subtle tightening of his jaw as he caught her looking at a name crossed out and rewritten in ink that was clearly newer. Some folks, he murmured, never wanted these stories to come out. Others benefited from them being lost. She felt the old kitchen light flicker, the shadows dancing across the room as if emphasizing the weight of what she had found. Sitting back on the floor, the ledger in her lap, she realized her father had not abandoned her to this ruin. He had left her breadcrumbs, carefully placed, leading toward a truth that no one else dared uncover. A protection that extended beyond death itself, a guidance she had only begun to follow. The weight of the ledger felt different now, no longer like old paper but like something sealed under pressure for decades, waiting for the moment it would finally fracture. She sat on the cold kitchen floor, the journal open across her knees, while Harold stood quietly near the counter, watching her trace the entries again. Slower this time, more precise, like each line might shift if examined correctly. Her eyes kept returning to the same pattern. Route 11 references, repeated parcel numbers, and handwritten notes that didn't match any public county record she had seen in the deed folder. Something about it no longer felt like memory, felt like structure, like ownership hidden inside accounting. She stood abruptly, ignoring the stiffness in her knees, and crossed to the box of documents from her father. With shaking hands, she pulled out the original deed again, comparing the parcel number printed there to the one written in the ledger. They didn't just match, they overlapped, with an added notation she hadn't noticed before. Trust classification filed under private estate authorization. Harold exhaled slowly when she read it out loud, his gaze dropping to the floor as if he already knew where this was going. "That's not a normal property deed," he said. "That's something they don't like people finding." The words pushed her into motion. Within an hour, she was in her car, ledger sealed inside a grocery bag beside her, driving through the mist toward the county records office, the wipers dragging across the windshield in slow, exhausted arcs. The building smelled like paper and fluorescent dust, the kind of place where truth was supposed to be permanent. She laid the ledger on the counter, watching the clerk adjust her glasses and pull up archived files. Minutes stretched into something heavier as page after page confirmed what she was seeing. A trust fund attached to the farmhouse land, dormant but never closed, with mineral rights and land easements still legally active under her father's name, and partially under hers. The clerk hesitated when she saw the classification stamp. "This shouldn't still be open," she murmured, almost to herself, scrolling back as if expecting the system to correct itself. But it didn't. Instead, another file surfaced, older, sealed under a different county label, showing transfers halted years ago after a legal dispute involving a development company and a blocked land acquisition. The name of that company made her stomach tighten because she had seen it before, scribbled faintly in the ledger margins where ink had been deliberately crossed out. Before she could ask more, her phone vibrated sharply against the counter. Unknown number. No caller ID. She didn't answer, but the clerk's expression changed anyway, as if she had just seen the same pressure arriving from somewhere outside the room. On the office wall, a security camera clicked slightly as it adjusted focus. When she stepped back outside, the air felt colder, and a black truck she didn't recognize was parked half a block down, engine running without urgency. Her phone rang again immediately after she got in her car. This time a different number, and a calm voice on the other end said, "We're only trying to help you understand what you're holding before it becomes a problem." She ended the call without responding. When she looked down at the ledger beside her seat, a new paper had been slipped inside it. One she hadn't seen before, printed on county letterhead, stamped urgently across the top. "Request for immediate property review, parcel 14B. And as she read it twice, she realized someone had already reopened the file she thought she had just discovered. The request for immediate property review, parcel 14B, sat on the passenger seat like it had weight beyond paper, as if it had already begun changing ownership simply by existing. She kept the ledger pressed against her thigh the entire drive back, her grip tightening every time the tires hit a crack in the road. When she returned to the farmhouse, the air inside felt different. Colder, sharper, as if the house had been entered while she was gone. Harold was still there, standing near the counter, but his expression shifted the moment he saw the paper in her hand. He didn't ask what it was. He already knew. "They move fast when that file opens," he said quietly. Not long after, the first knock came. Then another. This time it wasn't polite. A black SUV sat outside, engine off, two men in press coats stepping onto the porch with the calm precision of people who had done this many times before. One of them introduced himself as a county compliance officer, the other as a legal representative for a development interest group. Their voices stayed even, controlled, almost courteous as they stepped inside without being invited. The taller one placed a folder on the counter. "We're here about a clerical discrepancy involving parcel 14B, he said, sliding a document forward. "It's a simple correction. Nothing you need to worry about." The words were soft, but the implication wasn't. The second man adjusted his sleeve and added, "The property has been flagged for structural safety concerns. It's in everyone's best interest to resolve this quickly before it becomes a liability issue." She didn't sit. She opened the ledger instead, placing it on the table between them. The moment their eyes landed on it, something subtle changed in their posture. Not fear, but recognition, quickly masked. The taller man smiled faintly. "That book is not an official record," he said. "We have updated documentation." He slid another paper across the counter. "Purchase agreement. Pre-filled. Pre-signed in places." Her father's name appeared at the bottom, but the signature wasn't right. The ink pressure was wrong, the stroke slightly uneven in a way she recognized instantly from years of handling medical records and forged patient forms that never quite matched the original hand. Harold stepped forward for the first time, his voice lower now. "That's not his signature," he said. The man didn't deny it. He simply replied, "It's been standardized for administrative continuity." The phrase landed heavier than accusation. The county officer then placed a second document beside it, a notice of unpaid lien, followed by a notice of imminent seizure if voluntary transfer was not completed within 72 hours. "We're offering above assessed value," he added. "This is actually a favorable outcome for a property of this condition." The irony was almost invisible in his tone, but unmistakable in the word condition. Her phone vibrated in her pocket again. Another unknown number. She ignored it and instead lifted the ledger, opening it to a page she had photographed earlier but not fully studied. A name at the bottom of that page matched one of the men standing in front of her. Not as an official, as a witness. A signature line dated 17 years ago, tied to the same parcel number now under review. The realization didn't make her panic. It made her steady. She closed the ledger slowly and stepped back from the counter, but before she could say anything, the county officer glanced toward the window and added calmly, "If you choose not to sign, the property will be secured pending enforcement review. We're only trying to prevent misunderstandings." When they left, they didn't slam the door. They simply closed it as if they already owned the right to come back. On the counter, they left the unsigned agreement behind. But she noticed something else as she picked it up. A timestamp printed in the corner showing it had been drafted 2 weeks before her father's death, as if the decision had already been made long before she ever opened the door. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and printer ink as she stepped inside. The echo of her boots on the marble floor loud against the hushed murmurs of clerks and attorneys. The room was arranged as if waiting for judgment. Polished tables, high-backed chairs, and a brass bell that hadn't been rung in decades. She set the ledger on the table first, sliding it forward slowly, letting the leather-bound spine thump softly against the wood. Harold stood behind her, holding the folded deed and a small stack of receipts, his hands steady despite the tension. She opened the ledger, flipping to the page with her father's handwriting, showing names, dollar amounts, and dates that corresponded precisely with the county land records she had requested from the office. A copy of the deed with the corrected parcel number and notarized signature followed, and she laid the hospital bills and church records beside it, each document punctuating the room in quiet authority. The county compliance officer from before tried to interject, voice low and measured. "Procedures must be followed. You don't fully understand the liabilities here, and this building—" "Liabilities?" she interrupted softly, pointing to the ledger page, the ink slightly smudged from decades of use. "These people were saved, paid, protected, by my father." The officer's eyes flicked involuntarily to the names she highlighted, each entry documented, verified. A lawyer for the development company pushed papers forward, suggesting arbitration, noting her lack of representation, her small bank balance, her age, and implied inexperience. She slowly laid down the receipts showing past transfers, the trust account letter, and the bank envelopes, each one matching the ledger exactly, the stamp dates unarguable. Harold added softly, "I can confirm every entry I witnessed. He helped people." The room went silent, the weight of decades settling in with the physical evidence on the table. The opposing lawyer's pen hovered midair, frozen above the page, as she produced the signed land easement, proof of mineral rights, and a photocopy of a birth record, confirming her father's designation. Even the county officer stopped, pale, the words procedure dying on his tongue as he saw the documents stacked neatly, the ledger open, the receipts visible, and Harold's quiet affirmation. She took a deep breath, laying the photo of her father standing in front of the farmhouse, young and determined, beside the ledger. The silence thickened further as the opposing side realized every attempt to dispute was countered by layered, tangible evidence. The house, the papers, the ledger, the witnesses, all pointing toward the truth. She leaned back slightly, letting the realization settle in. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, the farmhouse she had inherited, once called junk, was commanding the respect and attention it deserved. Yet even in that moment, her gaze drifted toward the stack of documents, knowing that holding them was only the first step. She would have to decide how to wield this legacy, how to honor it, and how to use it to restore what had been quietly protected for decades. The judge's gavel never actually struck the wood again. It simply hovered in the air for a long second, as if even the court itself needed time to accept what had just been laid out across the table. The ledger remained open in front of her, its pages no longer just ink and paper but a full history of transactions, rescues, signatures, and quiet acts of protection that had been hidden under legal dust for years. The opposing attorney tried once more, voice carefully controlled, "Your Honor, this is an emotional interpretation of..." But he stopped when the judge lifted a single page from the stack and read the matching county stamp, then another, then the corrected parcel record with the trust classification that had never been properly closed. Harold stood quietly behind her, hands folded, no longer just a witness but a confirmation the room could not ignore. Outside the courthouse windows, afternoon light shifted across the marble floor like something finally moving forward after being stuck for too long. The compliance officer looked down at the deed copy, then at the ledger again, and when he spoke this time, the word procedure did not come back. Instead, there was silence, followed by a low acknowledgement that the filing would need to be corrected, formally reviewed, and legally reversed. The pen in the attorney's hand finally set down, not in defeat, but in recognition that there was nothing left to argue without crossing into something that no longer held weight. Hours later, the official order was read. The attempted transfer of Parcel 14B was void pending review of fraudulent documentation and improper signature verification. The lien was suspended. The emergency seizure notice was struck from the record. And for the first time since she had stepped into the farmhouse, the name of her father was written correctly again in the county ledger system without an asterisk or omission. When she returned, the farmhouse did not feel smaller. Felt anchored. The wind outside no longer sounded like intrusion but like something passing through without permission to stay. Harold placed the original brass key back into her hand, but this time he didn't call it old. He always said it only fits for the person who understands what it's opening, he said quietly. The development truck was gone from the road by morning, and the calls stopped coming after the notice of investigation was filed against the company's land acquisition attempt. No celebration filled the space that followed, only repair. Neighbors who had once laughed began returning, not with explanations, but with tools. Paint cans, lumber, old photos of the farmhouse when it still held life. The ledger was placed carefully on a clean shelf inside the house, not hidden anymore, but displayed like something that had finally finished surviving. She didn't sell the land. She didn't divide it. Instead, she opened the front room, cleared the counter, and placed her father's photograph above it, where the morning light could reach it first. The first morning the door opened again officially. A woman from town stepped inside and whispered, "We didn't think this place would ever belong to anyone again." And for the first time, she answered without hesitation, "It always did." That night, she slept inside the farmhouse with the ledger closed beside her, the key resting on the table instead of hidden away, and the house no longer sounded empty, only lived in, as if it had finally recognized the person it had been waiting for all along, and the silence that followed was not absence, but home finally becoming real.